Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I want to talk a little bit about reading philosophy. I'm entitling this video, Why Read Philosophy, Where to Start, and Where to Go. So the target audience is of course those of you who are thinking about reading philosophy, or you've started into it and found it extremely tedious and perhaps unnecessary, and so you've abandoned it. My own story is that I, of course, started out reading fiction all of my life growing up, and not really, didn't really have a taste for nonfiction. And then eventually, about a decade ago, as I was finishing grad school and, having to read a lot more excerpts from philosophy, but more literary criticism, I started to get really interested, and then I read Infinite Jest in January of 2011, and then I was piqued to the point where I had to start on my journey. So as I normally do, I like to start in chronological order and read my way through. In 2011, I did this. In fact, I recently recovered one of my notebooks, and you can see that my then one-year-old daughter scribbled and in fact adorned a lot of the pages with her artwork, which is totally fine with me. Here you can see, I guess she didn't really like Pascal's Pensées very much. But anyway, it's a real treat to go back and see what myself 8-9 years younger thought about a lot of this. And so recently I decided to pick up the Republic. This, as I'll talk about in a moment, I believe is the best beginning place for Western philosophy. And I got myself a brand new Luke Term 1917 journal to go with it, and so I can take fresh philosophy notes. And then 2 days after I decided to go back through all of the great works of Western philosophy, I went up and checked the mailbox, and what was there but none other than the latest edition of Philosophy Now, which is Ancient Greek Wisdom Today. And that's really look at that cover art. I love that. It's amazing. Only the cat is paying attention. So this was sort of, cosmic confirmation that I was doing the right thing. And then I got to thinking about it. I started, some of my friends, I started talking about what I was doing, and they said, I've been thinking about reading philosophy for a long time, but I just don't have tolerance for it. I don't know where to start. I've tried it, whatever. So I decided to make this video. Let's make it clear, if it isn't so far by now, that I am in no way a philosopher. I am not a student. Formally speaking, I'm not a student of philosopher. I've never taken a single philosophy class in school. And well, I did take an ethics course. So that is one of the branches of philosophy. And, it includes morality and so on. But I'm in no way qualified for this. And so for the most part, I have to consult a lot of secondary resources. Gregory B. Sadler here on YouTube is a phenomenal resource. He has been making videos for a long time. In fact, when I took on Kant and Hegel in 2012, I used a lot of his videos to understand what in the world was going on. But I hope that what I'm communicating here is that I'm not qualified really to grasp everything, but I have an interest and a passion. And Timothy Keller, in his commentary on the book of Proverbs, he says wisdom is not only for deep thinkers, it's how you get through daily life. And I love that. The more that I think about, read about philosophy and so on, the more I realize how true that is. Contrary to the cliche that is imprinted on the collective consciousness, it really isn't just for people who want to be extremely pious and so on, but it really is for everybody. And my reading experience nearly a decade ago was very fruitful because I realized that the reading of philosophy greatly enriches all other reading. it truly is like the great conversation from the whole Great Books series. It really is a conversation that's been going on for over 2,000 years by some of the greatest thinkers. And I'll say that what it is it's the best of recorded thought, because of course there certainly have been great thinkers that unfortunately we never got to hear from because their thoughts didn't get recorded. But if you think about it, we now in 2020, we have access to read over 2,000 years of the best of recorded thought. And so if we take the time to read and absorb these, what we're doing is we're laying a very strong foundation within our own minds for considering what is right and what isn't, and then continuing the discussion. If we don't take the time to read these, then what we're going to end up doing is wasting a lot of years thinking on our own and coming to conclusions that have probably already been met, a millennia ago or a millennium ago. And so, it's like the quip of standing on the shoulders of giants. But we don't want to remain dwarves, of course. The other thing to think about in terms of why read philosophy is because it is a conversation, you will begin to see connections. And this is why I argue for reading them in chronological order, at least to begin with, because each philosopher is building upon a previous one. If you just jump straight into Kant and his metaphysics, his great critique of pure reason, and you don't read Hume and Locke first, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on. But then even beyond the philosophy books as in their primary sources, if you're reading The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but you haven't read Nietzsche, and you read say Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, but you haven't really taken the time to read Wittgenstein, you're not going to get as much. Of course, you can consult references during the reading, but the more you lay that foundation, the more you're going to start making connections. And it's making those connections and then pulling them all together that really starts to take you from knowledge to wisdom. You're also, another reason to read philosophy is because you will be expanding and building upon what American philosopher Richard Rorty calls our final vocabulary. And to quote him, all human beings carry about a set of words which they employ to justify their actions, their beliefs, and their lives. These are the words in which we formulate praise of our friends and contempt for our enemies, our long-term projects, our deepest self-doubts, and highest hopes. I shall call these words a person's final vocabulary. Those words are as far as he can go with language. Beyond them is only helpless passivity or a resort to force. Now it's interesting, one connection that pops up immediately when he says those words are as far as he can go with language, I immediately think of Wittgenstein in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. One of his propositions, I think 5 dot or 6 dot something, I've talked about it elsewhere, one of his propositions is that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. So you see that these build off of each other. And in fact, now that I'm reading the Republic and I'm seeing how Plato or Socrates or Plato's Socrates is showing how an oligarchy can devolve into a democracy, and then because of too much freedom, a democracy can devolve into a tyranny. Then in Pascal and his Pensées, we see that he harps on the fact that too much freedom is deadly and can lead to tyranny. Well, of course, he's picking up from Plato. And in fact, a lot of people pick up from Plato. So let's go ahead and talk about where to start. If you want to get more of a survey, instead of taking each work individually and working through it, but you want to start with kind of a wide swathe of the landscape of Western literature, I highly recommend Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy. This is actually where I started back in 2011 when I decided to read through the Western the works of Western philosophy, I started with the history of philosophy. This is a great account. The Durants, they actually have a huge series of Western civilization, but this is just a single volume, and it's only about roughly 400 pages, and covers from Plato to the American philosophers, John Dewey, and so on. But it is very engaging, and it gives you a lot of the historical context that really makes everything pop. The other one I would recommend, it's a bit longer, and a lot more engaging, I argue, but the History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, and I featured this in another video. I think it's in my 10 nonfiction recommendations. But this one, this is the greatest resource for as far as a single volume of Western philosophy. If you're struggling with whether philosophy is even valid anymore, maybe you've really taken to heart Stephen Hawking's quip that philosophy's dead, it's been replaced by science and so on. Well, that is true to a degree. Obviously, if we're going to try to examine and think through some biological process, we're not going to use the dialectic method anymore. In the realm of ontological studies or metaphysics and so on, we're going to get into the laboratory. But there's always philosophy is at the core of everything. There's a philosophy of science, a philosophy of mind, a philosophy of politics, a philosophy of education. It really is that core because philosophy teaches you the best way to think about something. It's much more than just being smart or looking smart. That would be what Socrates decries as sophistry. Most notably in Thrasymachus in the Republic. But no, a true philosopher is someone who you want to think and formulate things the right way. And I would say that if that's your view, that philosophy is nonsense and so on, try Rebecca Goldstein's Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Will Never Die or Won't Go Away. This is great. This is, as you can tell from the title, this is a fun book. In one volume, you get acquainted with Plato, which again, for me, for most, this is traditionally the beginnings of Western philosophy. There are the pre-Socratics, Democritus, and so on, but Plato is really the beginning. And in fact, Alfred North Whitehead, in his book Process and Reality, he says that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So you may have heard that before, that all of Western philosophy is but footnotes to Plato. You get deep looks into Plato, and then you get this fun little situation where Plato is placed into the work environment of Google, and then a good, strong case for why philosophy is not dead and in fact won't go away. As far as primary texts, again, the Republic, the Callipolis is the best starting place. It's really the beginning. It covers everything, which is great. In this one dialogue, it is a dialogue. You get epistemology, the study of knowledge, how we can have it, what it is, through the education of the philosopher kings. You get ontology, which is the study of being or metaphysics and his conception of forms. You get ethics, you get aesthetics, where he talks about the prescribed art and music, even though there's a big dimension of censorship going on here. And I think it's books 3 and 10. I think it's 3. Can't quite remember that first one, but then it's picked up again in the final volume. But there's a lot to be said as far as art, literature, and so on, right here at the beginning. Logic, you get the beginnings of formal logic in here, although it's nothing like the analytical philosophy of Bertrand Russell and Bergson and others. Political philosophy, the main question of the text is what is just and what is unjust? What is justice versus injustice? And is a just person truly happier than an unjust person? Because they are showing that unjust people go and satisfy their desires. You know, they're very selfish, very hedonistic, and they do appear to be, at least worldly wise, happier. And so Socrates decides that the best way to approach this problem is not by looking at an individual, but by looking at something on a much larger scale, which would be a polis, or a city. And of course, a polis at this time is not, you know, a city as we think about today with a bunch of buildings and so on, but it's this group of lots of people in one area. And so if they build up what they call a Kallipolis, which is from just two Greek words that mean beautiful and city, so the beautiful city, the utopia, the republic of Plato, if they build this up from scratch, then they'll get to examine and observe the inception of justice. And that will allow them to be able to better examine it as transposed to the individual. So it's really a brilliant and engaging dialogue to watch how Socrates and his interlocutors build up this city just using their thoughts and words. We get these great and famous analogies, the sun analogy, the lion analogy, and of course the cave analogy, which you've probably heard of. And then by the end of it, in this one roughly 300 pages of dialogue, you will have a philosophical foundation upon which to build and go further. And again, the majority of all subsequent philosophers, novelists, painters, really do engage with Plato in one way or another. So let's talk about where to go from the Republic. I have a list of 26 books that I've put together by, you know, basically curating other people's lists and weighing them and examining them and so on. I won't go all into what I've done because it's not that interesting. You know, it's pretty much just an Excel sheet with columns that represent different lists of the greatest works of Western philosophy, looking at where there's overlap through the lists and then trimming out some of the outliers. To try and get it, you know, down to just the highlights as much as possible, though as with any list, we're being exclusive and we're leaving out a lot. But again, this is just prescribed for, you know, people are saying, where do I go from here? How do I hit the whole, you know, main swathe of Western philosophy? Well, as I said, start with Plato's Republic. I would move to the Nicomachean Ethics from Aristotle, the Prince from Machiavelli, and then Francis Bacon's Essays, Descartes, the Meditations and the Discourse on Method, Hobbes, the Leviathan, Spinoza, his Ethics, and I would also argue for his Theological-Political Treatise. Although the Ethics are the main thing. And then Pascal, the Pensées. My books are falling everywhere. Locke, the Second Treatise of Government. And then, of course, let's start getting into some big boy. Well, the Leviathan's pretty large, but the essay on human understanding. This is part of the British empiricism, and it also goes in tandem with Berkeley's The Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge. This is going to look at the old riddle of if a tree falls in the woods, can we really say that it fell? Like that book that just fell. I wasn't watching it, but it fell. I heard it. Well, okay, we're getting into sense perception and so on, and I won't spoiler alert, and I won't spoil Berkeley, how he deals with it. But David Hume, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, this is very, very critical. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and this is of course his basic political writings, but what you're really wanting is on the social contract, Critique of Pure Reason. This is a big boy. Once you start getting into the German idealism, you will want to consult secondary resources. And in fact, look at this that I printed out back in 2012. This is sort of a mind map of what's going on in the critique. And I actually did use this to try and follow along This was the hardest thing I had ever read up to that point. But luckily, about a year after he published it, I think even philosophers with whom he was trying to engage were so confused, he gave us this short little treatise called A Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. And this, in a very thin volume, breaks down his main points in the Critique of Pure Reason. It cannot be missed. Once you make it through that, you may want to take a break before moving on to Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit. This is, even Gregory B. Sadler will tell you that he's not sure Hegel understood everything that Hegel was saying. Nonetheless, it is one of the touchstones of Western philosophy. Then, for some more German idealism, The World as Will and Presentation in 2 volumes, Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is very important, especially in terms of German music, with Wagner. Was Schopenhauerian, I don't know. And then Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and also Das Kapital, mainly Volume 1. Like Voltaire and Candide, I cannot find that anywhere. I've lost both of them somehow, so I guess I'll have to acquire new ones. Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling. This is the, as Harold Bloom says, Kierkegaard is the greatest melancholy Dane next to Hamlet, which I love that. Nietzsche, once you get to Nietzsche, this is when you start realizing that philosophy can be extremely fun to read. Nietzsche, there's a lot to be said, and I'm going to reserve that for my bookshelf tour once I get to my philosophy shelf. But what you're going to really want to focus on with Nietzsche, if you're very literary and artistic minded, you'll probably want to read The Birth of Tragedy, but for the purposes of this video, I'm prescribing on the genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil. Martin Heidegger, Being and Time. And then finally, Wittgenstein, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and the Philosophical Investigations. You're going to want to do both of those. And in here, they have the what's called the Blue Book and the Brown Book together with the Tractatus and another one. So I definitely recommend those. So that's it. That's my spiel on why you should read philosophy, why you don't need to be a philosopher or have training in formal philosophical thinking to enjoy it. The biggest argument I can give, again, just to close this video out, is that the more you read throughout the works of philosophy, the more you are going to lay that foundation that you will see is critical to unlocking more and more of everything else you read. The other biggest argument I can say is that for anyone who loves language and is sensitive to language and what it can do, just as Socrates was in the Republic, he talks about how if you don't take the time to talk out and write out exactly what you mean when you say something, such as the tripartition of the soul into the appetitive part and the rational part and the spirited part, then when you say soul, you don't really know exactly what you're talking about, and the people with whom you're conversing don't really know what you're talking about. And so it forces you to learn language and to utilize language and exhaust language, take it to the absolute edges of what it can do, because you're using it to explicate things that are greater than us. And so it's very, very different than a picture or a video or music. You're taking this very, very malleable thing called language and you're using it, you're learning to use it like a sculptor to be very, very precise. And you'll find that the more you make yourself sensitive to that from watching others do it, the more you will begin to do it yourself. And this makes you more articulate and more of a critical thinker.